1, 2, 3. If I could tell the things that I've been shown, I'd tell of mountains I've seen, the giants I have known. I've walked with them, so what they could see.
So that's why I have looked for a text for our European Studies course that would approach things the way Henry has approached things. And
a different place to me. On those mighty shoulders I once saw, and how they learned to see. Yes, on those giant shoulders I know all that I am called to be. On giant shoulders.
Welcome back to the Book Distillery podcast. We are the Blue Collar Scholars, and we are discussing books that matter. And this week's book is the Saving Europe book, which was written by an amazing author called Henry Vyner-Brooks. Joining us tonight is a very special guest. It's Mr. Jeff Fountain, who, after serving as the European Director of YWAM for 20 years, Jeff started the Schumann Center for European Studies in 2010 in Amsterdam. He is the author of Deeply Rooted, The Forgotten Vision of Robert Schumann. Originally from New Zealand, Jeff has lived in the Netherlands since 1975 with his Dutch wife, Ronke. They have 3 married sons and 8 grandchildren. Since 2007, Jeff and Ronke lived in Amsterdam, where they continue to run courses and events. He writes books and blogs, leads European cultural tours with a Christian focus, and of course, the State of Europe Forum. Do you want to tell us about that, Jeff? Because that's coming up soon, isn't it? A new one.
Yeah, sure. Since 2011, we've been holding an event in the capital of the country with the presidency of the EU on Europe Day, or around Europe Day, which hardly anybody knows is May the 9th, which in 1950, May the 9th, at 6 p.m., Robert Schumann read a 3-minute statement, which I called the defining moment of post-war Europe, because after he had read that statement, there was a plan on the table. Before it, there wasn't. And it was a plan that actually had rocked the world. It was total surprise, even for his own prime minister, who he had cleverly kept in the dark. It was the plan to have the coal and steel, build a coal and steel community, sharing resources and actually being in mutual submission to each other. So never before in history had there been a defeated enemy treated on the same level as the victors. And that was an event that took place because of Christian forgiveness and reconciliation. And that was a story that I heard first in 1991, and it made me think very differently about all the processes that had been going on in Brussels. And I thought, wow, we need to get to know that. So the State of Europe Forum is an attempt to bring together people from different disciplines, different church backgrounds, from Pentecostal to Orthodox, and from all across Europe, to look at the state of Europe in the light of Robert Schumann's vision for a community of peoples deeply rooted in basic Christian values. We've actually missed here and there. COVID, of course, has been one of the reasons for that, but we've done online alternatives. And so we plan to hold the next one in Paris, which, of course, France has the presidency right now. And that'll be May the 6th and 7th, Friday night, a public meeting, and then the 7th will be a forum. And what we usually do is try to have some kind of historic place where we hold a public event, focusing in what took place on May the 9th, 1950. And then the next day we have the forum proper. And so, for example, the last one we were able to hold actually was in Bucharest in 2019. And there we were in the Patriarch's Palace for the May 9th event. And then the forum was in the People's Palace, which is the humongous parliamentary headquarters that was a megalomaniac project by Ceausescu.
In that palace in Bucharest, the People's Palace, an Irishman was broke in and was arrested. He was drunk. He'd come back from a wedding party. This happened last year. It's true because I read it in the tabloids. So there you go. Let's edit that out, shall we? Thanks, Jeff. I'm going to... It's true. I couldn't believe it. It's the People's Palace. He didn't know. He thought it was his hotel. Fine. Welcome tonight, everybody, if you're joining us online, and welcome also the Blue Collar Scholars. We've got Richard down there with the gamer's headphones on, and we've got Jeff and Andrew's here with very, very good news. We were the first to bring you Harry Moyse's engagement and marriage, and now we are the first to announce that Andrew has done an incredible thing. Yeah.
Well done.
Susanna, a beautiful, wonderful, godly woman. So we're chuffed for you. She is a lovely, lovely girl. Right, tonight, coming up on your screens there, you will see we are going to handle this in 5 15-minute sections. The introduction of the epilogue, which is it's probably a 20,000 word chapter. So we're going to have to comb through the material. The introduction, which is called the Looming Crisis in this chapter, and it talks about the 3 legs of European stability, which are now very much under threat and have been for some time. Number 2, our great quest for the soul of Europe, the historic quest for the soul of Western Europe and its failure. And this is a call that's come from secular and religious leaders on the European scene for ages. So we'll discuss that. Number 3, becoming les personnes des frontières, which is how Schumann was described. These people that lived on the frontiers, the border people brought the solution, because of course you bring a solution when the problem's on your doorstep. And so he'd always known from a young age what he had to do. So this is a call for Christians, this part of the chapter, to engage constructively in culture and to resist the siren call of a pseudo-Christian populism. Then there is part 4, our 4th section tonight, making Lessing's ditch less ugly. This is to reissue the challenge of Schumann that European integration could not survive if it was solely an economic and technical exercise. And we'll talk about what Lessing's ditch is. This is Gottfried Lessing, German philosopher, and we'll look at the failure of the Enlightenment settlement as it stands now, and a kind of, not secularism per se, but a neo-secular hegemonic kind of regime that we're living under. Okay, so that's something we can discuss and debate. And then number 5, we'll wrap up with a sort of personal challenge that I bring at the end of that chapter. So that is the roundup for tonight. We're going to take them. If they don't take 15 minutes, we just move on. So would anyone want to make any broad comments at the outset about the first part and how this kind of opens up to us? What I didn't do, and which perhaps what we should have done, is looked at a bit of chapter 18. I did suggest that when we do it with Jonathan Chaplin. That sort of deals with the beginnings of the EU or the EEC going into the EU and some of the problems. But we're going to talk about the looming crisis. So I'm going to hand over. You guys, I've spoken enough. Tell me what you think, what struck you, what was new, what was a challenge, what you disagreed with.
Well, I'd just like to say, in the context of the whole book, this is a bookend. You begin really with the origins of Europe, and then you're ending with this epilogue of looking to the future. So people might think, well, this is just kind of a dual biography of Columbanus at one end of European consciousness and Robert Schumann at the other end. I was deeply impressed by the fact that you've been able to weave all these other dimensions into the story, making it much more than just biographical. Yeah. But you've got some serious reflection going on about where we've come from and where we needing to go to. And that has made this book, I think, very, very useful. It's certainly useful for the course in European studies that we run as a Schumann Center. And I plan to be using it for our texts. In fact, I ordered copies for each of our associates in different countries, in Latvia and Romania and so on. Been getting responses now from people. The books have been finally arriving. And I just want to thank you very much for this forward-looking reflection in the light of this long prologue that you've given us. And I think very, very helpful indeed.
Yeah, I didn't mention this at the beginning, and I might just splice this back. But just for everyone listening, it was actually at the State of Europe Forum that I first heard this story. So the same story that captured Jeff's imagination. Did you say 1975, Jeff? Then you first
Well, 1991 was when
91.
I first began hearing about the Schumann story.
Yeah. And so really for me, it was 20 years later, and Jeff was obviously part of that, and his own book, Deeply Rooted, was one of the kind of primary sources at the beginning of my study, just to get an idea of what was going on. So,
well, I must say I learned a lot about Robert Schumann reading your book.
Well, all I did was I got all the best stuff I could get. Richard helped translate de Roqueford's French biography for me. And
yeah, that must have been very, very useful.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah, I wonder if it should be translated into English. I feel that it needs to be available. It's a bit of a hagiography, but it's very useful.
When I started, I didn't actually set out to write a book. It's a funny story. I was actually in New Zealand in 2010. I was on my way back to Holland. I went to teach for a week in Perth on the way. Went out to the airport and they said, sorry, the airport's closed. Singapore is totally closed because of the Icelandic ash cloud. I was stranded there for 2 weeks. And so I went back to the YWAM base and they gave me an apartment. I was all there on my own except for 3 goldfish and started to put together, gather materials that I had. And by the end of those 2 weeks, I sent off the PDF file to my publisher back in Holland. When I landed here in Amsterdam, he had it already printed for me. So it was kind of a, it was, we say in Dutch, geluk bij ongeluk, something positive that came out of a negative situation. It forced me to get this story down, but there wasn't anything in English on him. Not just telling the story. And since then, I've discovered people like Margriet Kretenberg, who did a doctorate on Schumann, and Victoria Martin de la Torre, who's got an excellent book about the founding fathers as a whole. But there just has not been much in English. And quite frankly, when I ask people, do you know who Robert Schumann was? Oh, yeah, he was a composer, wasn't he? Yeah, okay, wrong century, wrong nationality. I asked my kids, did you ever hear about them? Robert Schumann in school or university. They studied in England and Holland. No, never. It's the best kept secret. Yeah. So that's how that came into being.
I thought that was a really nice story. Sorry, just to jump in. Feel free to edit or cut this to a different point, Henry. But I was actually going to ask about that, like that link between Jeff and Henry, like the fact that you guys met. I just felt like that was a really kind of nice link in with the theme of the book, really. The importance of networks and the value of connecting with other people and kind of having a similar vision for something. I just felt like it was a really lovely story that actually, there's, I don't know if maybe Henry will link to this in the comments below this video, but Jeff interviewed Henry about the book on his forum recently. And it was quite moving actually to see that a conversation that Jeff and Henry had 10-12 years ago had then sparked something that's moved into a bit of a movement. So I was really quite touched by that. I thought that was great.
Yeah, and just to reiterate what Jeff said, it's very true that it comes up in the book a lot. The collaboration, the supporting each other, the iron sharpens iron. You expect with a biography, even of 2 different men at different times, it to be just looking at them, but it's very much this ongoing story of many people coming together to do great work together. So it's a real inspiration.
Well, it was in the context of a conference at the Free University that was, of course, started by Abraham Kuyper. And Kuyper pops up throughout the book as well. And he's another major character who has shaped my life. In fact, I'm talking right now from the street where Kuyper lived. I live in Prince Hendrikade number 50. He was Prince Hendrikade number 175. He walked past the front of this building many times on his way to the newspaper office. That's a few hundred meters from here, or down to the new church, which is about 500 meters from here, where he gave his famous speech that there's not 1 square inch of human life where Christ, who's sovereign over all, does not say mine. The original Free University building is a few canals over. And in fact, just yesterday, I was walking down the Zeedijk here, And I was telling my wife about this funny little restaurant that we all traipsed over to. Do you remember that, Henry?
Near Newmarket.
Bowles was the professor who had organized this all, and he led us. We went on the trams and several tram trips and so on, and walked through to the inner city. And we went to this really crazy retro restaurant that was, you'd think, well, there's something special that we're going to. In fact, we were just very close, just a stone's throw from the Var, which is the oldest secular building in the city, and that's a lovely restaurant. But somehow we went to this crummy. But
very near.
Nevertheless, it was in that situation where we started talking, and that led to Henry coming to Dublin and so on.
Wow. Jeff, I'm excited. I was going to ask you about Kuyper, and you're all over him. Because I'm from the school of Kuyper. I was discipled in Bath, where I grew up, by part of the very tiny Kuiperian movement in this country. A guy called Richard Russell. Do you know Richard and Jan?
Only I've seen him on some of the programs that you've run. Yeah.
I have another question. I was on a course in London where we found out about the YWAM Seven Mountains vision. And I was fascinated to connect that to Kuyper's vision of renewal of society and mission for the culture. Are you more a Kuyper man and less of a Seven Mountain man?
Well, I'm afraid the Seven Mountains has become a monster.
Right.
I didn't want to join YWAM, to be honest, way back in the 70s. I felt it was a Bible-bashing outfit. But I was invited to come and join something called Dilaram by a man named Floyd McClung, who later became the international director of YWAM.
Yeah.
By the time I arrived here in Amsterdam, he had brought Dilaram under the umbrella of Youth with a Mission. Now, I was well familiar with Youth with a Mission, had met Lauren Cunningham way back in his first trip to New Zealand in 1967.
Wow.
And that was just 7 years after he started YWAM. All the YWAMers in the world could have had their global conference in a telephone booth then. I admired Lauren's vision for mobilizing young people, but my own university experience and difficulty of trying to relate my studies to my experiential faith has set me on a course that had helped me to discover reformational thinking through Francis Schaeffer, firstly, Rookmarker, and then somebody introduced me to Cowper. This is back in the early 70s. And so then I began to realize, hey, there's a whole framework here for thinking about life. Now, so I get to Holland, and we had a conference actually in Chichester, in South England, where Lauren, this is August 75 or September 75, Lauren then describes his epiphany on a mountaintop in Colorado of this seven, or he didn't call them mountains. He talked at that time about 6, what he called mind molders or classrooms to disciple the nations. And I thought, well, this is, kind of an elementary form of Cowper. Maybe if YWAM's going to move in this direction, there's hope. And so, we've talked about it a lot, talked about Cowper, but, and this was influencing the way in which the University of the Nations, that Youth with a Mission started, would be shaped. But I'm afraid we haven't really pursued, we're a little bit afraid of theology and philosophy. The problem is, though, you end up with an unexamined theology, you end up with an unexamined philosophy. And because of that, what has happened is that people have picked up Lauren's ideas and Bill Bright's ideas, which is basically just coming to realize, hey, there are all these spheres in society that every government has to deal with, and ministers, appointed out to look over those things. It wasn't really rocket science. But it was coming from a Pentecostal evangelical background and realizing, actually, if we talk about Christ being Lord of all, it means he's Lord in all these areas. What does that actually mean? Yes. But we have not had a Cowper to actually lead us in thinking, or a Hammond Doyard. What does that mean? What should it look like? And I think we're going to come back to that when we look at some of the other questions. I
love it. When you say it's an elementary form of Kuyper, that's exactly what I concluded from reading all the books. And I thought, if this is a way to get Pentecostals thinking about thinking seriously about mission, then that's great.
Well, I called it a monster because it's been hijacked. It's been hijacked by the Seven Mountain Movement that is saying we need to get Christians into the top positions in all these different mountains, reclaim society, and basically get justice for us. It's not justice for all. It's not a vision of pluralism, and it's created the awful polarization that we see in America today. Yeah,
I'm kind of delighted that you're being so frank. The thing is, in American culture, they really struggle. The way the whole culture is built. I mean, my country struggles with this a little. To think in the European way about institutions as institutions, and in the States, generally, you give them a model like that and they think, okay, so it's about the guy in charge of that thing, instead of it's about the institution. It's just a struggle. So what they've done is they've individualized it into leadership and pyramid.
Yeah, and it's not servanthood leadership. It's making things safe for us as Christians.
Mm-hmm. Justice is justice.
Is what COIP is about. Yeah, thank you so much. That's brilliant.
So we're talking about the three legs of European stability. The three-legged stool, the two legs, economic stability, supposedly guaranteed by the EU, military stability, supposedly guaranteed by NATO, and then this other, more elusive aspect that is called the soul of Europe, talked about by the often reactionary Jacques Delors, and who else talked about it? Did anyone want to make any comments about that?
It was quite interesting just sort of starting into this chapter, this epilogue, because I read the first sort of couple of pages where you just state what you just stated, and it was so striking that I sort of almost had to stop there and just sort of mull it over and come back to get onto anything else the next day or something, because it's quite a striking thing to just think, there are different facets, different items going on, and it's very easy in any sort of discussion to get sidetracked into one particular one. I found during the whole of 2016, even 2015, with the whole discussion about Brexit, everyone was just talking about economics. That was all that everyone talked about, and I only really realized that a couple of years afterwards. That wait a second, there are other things.
That's right.
And if something entirely different is completely wrong, actually the whole thing falls apart. So the very simple thing that someone pointed out to me was the big issue they had with the whole of the European setup was the lack of democratic checks and balances, which is something that the British parliamentary system has in bucketfuls, which is really wonderful and quite a thing. But if you don't have that, then
I mean, what I'd say is, so we've got I'm going to use this as a prop.
Go for it.
Imagine that's a three-legged stool, this little light I've got, and so you have the three legs. And Schumann's warning us, don't make it just a technocratic enterprise. It won't work, because the institutions are like bracing between the legs, a lateral brace. And they exercise obviously a very useful function on your stool, but they can't be legs. They can't be those main things. Obviously, economic stability, security is a big thing. And then this thing, the thing that Mama Merkel was calling for and worried about, the thing that Schuman talked about, and the soul of Europe. So does anybody else want to sort of, I don't think I invented that idea. I must have got it from somewhere, so it'll be footnoted, but that's how people have talked about it.
I was curious to know what Jeff thought of what Andy said about the argument for Brexit and parliamentary sovereignty.
Well, let me first say this. I think if Jonathan Chaplin was involved in this talk, which was the original plan, he would make a plea for talking about the souls of Europe, plural, because that's what he did at our State of Europe Forum in 2016 here in Amsterdam, which was just before Brexit, before the referendum, I should say. And yet, I'm not sure if I fully agree. I think he was making a plea for pluralism, which I fully agree with. But we need to ask ourselves, what do we mean by a soul? And of course, as Henry points out in the book, we're drawing from Jacques Delors, who gave a speech several times. Actually, I think you say 1995, 1992, I believe, was more the time when he was retiring as the president of the Commission. He said, if we have not found a soul for Europe within the next 10 years, and I mean by soul, spirituality and meaning, then the game will be up. Now, of course, we're well behind after his deadline now. That would have been 2002. And so we're actually 20 years beyond his deadline. And he was a devout Catholic and very aware of Catholic social thinking as well. And I think we need to ask ourselves, what is a soul generally? What we say the soul of something is what animates us. It gives us life. It's the source of our life, source of our values, a source of our worldview, if you like. And both Delors, as well as Schumann, and of course, as well as people like Jacques Maritain and Christopher Dawson, whom you quote liberally in the book, and I was thrilled to see that. They keep pointing to, what has actually given Europe its values, its understanding of history, of time, an underlying unity with lots of diversity. Just think of the image of the cross that's used in all sorts of, whether a Celtic cross or an Armenian cross or a Greek cross or a Latin cross and so forth. There's so much unity with diversity. Now, because of the allergic reaction to Christianity after the Enlightenment, we can't talk about that. And of course, in the French situation, you have the situation of laicité. We're not allowed to, let religion come into the politics, as it were. We don't want to find our soul by looking where we ought to look. It's like the proverbial story of the drunk who's groveling under a lamppost, and somebody says, "Have you lost something?" "Yeah, I've lost my keys." "Where did you drop them?" "Oh, over there in the darkness, but there's more light here." And this is a bit the European way of wanting to find the soul, but we don't want to go back to the Dark Ages to find it. Ironically, the Dark Ages was a time where a lot of lights came on, and the Enlightenment was a time when a lot of lights went out. And so that's why I have looked for a text for our European Studies course that would approach things the way Henry has approached things, and quoting many of the people that I've drawn sustenance from. And we need to be able to redeem this concept of the soul being the source of our life. Where does it come from? Now, I think that we in our evangelical world, those of us who identify as evangelicals, we pride ourselves on being people of the Bible. But actually, we don't know our Bible very well, and we don't know the consequences of the Bible, how the Bible has so shaped almost every aspect of European culture, as Tom Holland has started to make us aware recently. And this is a story that we've got to recover. Where is there a museum in the whole of Europe that tells that story? And a few years ago, they had a Bible exhibition in the European Parliament. And the Christian European parliamentarians were very excited to have this first recognition officially from the European Parliament of the Bible. So here were these Bible Society stands, roll up banners on why we call the Bible the Word of God, and how it came to us, and how it was translated, and how it was distributed. And that was it. I thought, so what? Nothing about how the Bible shaped our politics, how the Bible shaped our law, how the Bible shaped our democracy, how the Bible shaped the beginning of the EU. We don't know those stories. So there's just a lot of ignorance there that is actually holding us back from becoming the people that, this chapter talks about later on.
The person front. It is, we need to have some really careful discussion about that. And finding this cultural, I've just been, it's been in the news a lot. This is 2022 for those of you joining us in the future, and there's been a lot of discussion about mass formation psychosis, and what comes out, of course, is the terrible ennui that people live with all the time. 60-something% of people find no meaning at all in their jobs. They just endure each week, and they have a free floating anxiety. And that's before COVID comes. And you can see that how people then have no sense of belonging. The isolation and the atomization is palpable. It's not surprising that when you might go trusting institutions to fill that vacuum, in your life, but it's there's something that in chapter 18 that T.S. Eliot says, and he talks about liberalism. This is fascinating, and he says it has a tendency to release energy and not to accumulate it, which I thought was very interesting. Also, I've been reading this week and studying Dostoevsky's prophetic novel Demons, or it's sometimes called The Possessed. Has anyone read that book? I'm really thinking it could be a book for our time. But that essentially, his thesis there in the novel is that liberalism will tend to revolution. Secular liberalism will always succumb to the revolutionary aspects. And of course, that was prophetic in his own not in his generation, his grandchildren's generation. So yeah, two things about sort of dissipation, and so needing some kind of strong, life-giving, nurturing this soul of Europe anyway. So anything else you wanted to say before we moved on to this about becoming people of different, because Jeff's already kind of transgressing into that part 3.
Got like a slightly uncomfortable question. So, and I think you've actually probably already answered this really, really, Jeff, but I'm just wondering, could the accusation be leveled against us as evangelical white males? Could the accusation be leveled against us that we're misappropriating history in some way? And if someone were to say that and say, you're just reading your Bible into history, what's a kind of refutation of that? Like, could you give maybe some summaries of ways that the Bible has influenced, or that the Christian faith or a Christian outlook has influenced the European history and European politics? I know that's a huge thing to ask you to summarize, but just to give maybe a little bit more ground for the discussion for anyone who's watching.
It would hijack tonight's.
It's quite. Chapter 15 does subject. A bit of that. I would say this though, Jeff, that in this chapter, and this is for anyone who's not a Christian who's listening, is that this chapter is written as a plea for dialogue, and it's harder on Christians, this chapter, and it points out really that a lot of the dogmatism that we have now and the repression that's happening is a direct result because the secular world has learned all the wrong lessons from the church, really, and so we carry quite a. And I've just listened to the chapter through one more time this afternoon, and that comes over again and again, that we are in a sense now suffering for the sins of our ancestors, who did not allow freedom of conscience to some people at times, these state cults. So
Yeah, fascinating point. Thanks. I recognise time's short, so maybe just leave that.
Well, but Jeff, it's an important question, needs to be kept in our mind, but that's why it's very interesting to see people like Tom Holland, Larry, inventing the individual, Seedentop, and others beginning to discover, actually, these things that we were told came out of the Enlightenment, came out much earlier. For example, the concept of the individual. His book only actually doesn't even get to Renaissance. They're coming from, in the case of Tom Holland, he wasn't at all. It was a kind of discovery. Hey, where do I get my values from? I don't get them from the Romans. I don't get them from the Greeks. I don't get them from the Persians. Actually, it's Christianity. And that's why he wrote that article, I think it was New Statesman, why I was wrong about Christianity. So it's an important question, Jeffrey. We could spend a lot of time. In fact, we do a whole course on that, looking at European history in this way. And we're going to be getting to this if we stay on our points. So we'll come back to that.
And these aren't sort of just academic conversations. What we talk about, or what the cultural health of Europe is absolutely. And we say we are part of Europe, whether we're, part of the EU or not. And you can see that an impoverished, culturally or kind of spiritually impoverished Europe has tremendous implications for foreign policy, because I think it was the titanism of economic. This was another T.S. Eliot, I think, saying that in the absence of a genuine spirituality, that the titanism of industry and the economic community becomes kind of the god. So point number 2 then, we're talking about, or 3 rather, section 3, becoming les personnes des frontières. And this is the call essentially for Christians to engage constructively in culture and to learn the kind of nuance that Jeff's been talking about, obviously to resist the siren call of a pseudo-Christian populism. I mean, we've got 1930s Germany to learn from there, and other parts of Europe even now. So we have to figure out what that means. So do you want to talk about that, please, your comments on that section? One at a time, please.
I was just glancing at the first paragraph, and it's quite moving. Again, like, you know, that kind of what is it? When you're talking about your journey across Western Europe, Henry, it feels as if you're looking for the same thing as your European neighbours, a key, or at least the secret door which could bring cultural renewal and international solidarity had been locked to us. I think, like, just to kind of underline what I think Jeff and Henry have already said this evening, that it's really important to be telling these stories and to kind of write it down and for future generations of Europeans as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Begs a question, Henry.
Yeah.
Where can Christians go to be equipped to engage constructively in culture? Now, I have just last year completed research on evangelicals and European integration. What has been the attitude of evangelicals towards European integration, the EU, etc.? I interviewed 20 evangelical leaders and academics and specialists to get their opinion. Where are evangelicals at? Now, the overwhelming attitude was ignorance and indifference. Secondly came, well, it's modern Babylon, you know, it's the Tower of Babel, etc., etc. Thirdly was, well, national sovereignty as the nation state as God's plan, and even though it only came up, Treaty of Westphalia, etc. So I then was also looking what historical influences have shaped these different attitudes, and there's too much to go into it here. But then I researched 69 seminaries that belong to the European Council of Theological Education, to see now where are there courses either on European studies or public theology, and I could hardly find anything. It just is not on our horizon. Theological seminaries are focused on the church; they're not focused on society. And of course, raising the whole issue of public theology requires definitions and all sorts of debate going on there. But that's a real problem. It's just not on our horizon. It's not the way our church leaders think. It's not the way theologians think. And so we can call for Christians to engage, but where are they going to be trained? Where can they be equipped? And it will require cross-disciplinary, not just theology, but it requires philosophy, political science, and sociology, and history, and so forth. And what you call the pseudo-Christian populism is what results from not having this kind of training available. The awful situation in America, the awful situation in different parts of Europe, where Christians are saying, oh, you know, this person's for the renewal of Judeo-Christianity and so forth. And we are just so naive about the whole thing. And I think this is a huge problem. In fact, tomorrow I'm going to be doing a Zoom with the European Evangelical Alliance. Once a month they have this Zoom lunch event. They've asked me to talk about public theology, and that'll get into a whole discussion as well. We are looking to hold consultations on how can we promote public theology. Of course, Jonathan Chaplin, who's missing from our talk right now, is a political theologian. And he says, he was one of the 20 that I interviewed actually, and he was appalled at the what did he call it? The dearth of theological reflection on the European Union in Great Britain that has allowed, something like Brexit to happen, in his opinion. So, here is a huge need, and it requires an understanding of history. I'll put it this way: when you're talking about the call for Christians to engage, we need to be rooted in the past, focused on the future in order to be effectively engaged in the present. And we need to also recognize that the Bible is the only sacred book that takes history seriously, that it is structured, both the Old Testament and the New Testament, in terms of past, present, and future. It begins with books about the past, both Old and New Testament. It finishes with books about the future, both Old and New. And in between are books that tell us how to live today in the light of what God's done in the past and what he wants to do in the future. Now, this three-dimensional sense needs to be captured for Christians to begin to get an understanding of our identity and our calling and what we are to do, because we've understood what God has been doing in the past and we understand where he's going to. We have a teleological perspective on the future, and this is missing. So if you're saying, well, how can we engage constructively in culture? That'll be part of the issue. And that's, again, I come back to your book and I say this has been a very helpful contribution to making people understand how has Europe been shaped.
Yeah, I'm just looking at, there's a Maritain quote, and he was adamant that we should shun every attempt at a clerical or decorative Christian state, which were attempted in the absolutist era. And that's probably where a lot of Christians still think. They just think if we get our guy into the White House or our guy into number 10. But so, Richard, did you want to come back on any of those things as we talk about this?
Sorry, I've been so excited listening to what Jeff said. I've just been writing up my notes about Jeff, so I've not been listening to everything that's been said. Yeah,
Schumann.
I think what you're saying is really good as well, Jeff. Just to echo Richard a bit.
I'm very excited. I'm very pleased to have met you.
Yeah, discussion this evening, but I'm very much aware listening into this conversation that it's people of my generation who are going to need to be really thinking about this and doing something about it soon, or sooner rather than later, if we want to have some kind of impact for the people coming after us as well. So feel free to edit this out if you don't want this in the chat, Henry. But for those kinds of discussions are involved in, Jeff, and if there's any kind of consultations or anything like that happens off the back of that, please do loop in us or me via Henry somehow. Love to be involved.
I wonder whether the more I think about it, when I think about the idea of ethic halls, this is the idea of training, sort of basically a hall of residence that is staffed. So it's a bit somewhere between L'Abri and a student hall of residence. We worked out it's a very viable business model. You have visiting intellectuals come to stay in a flat, give talks. It could be a really cool place. Anyway, I have never been able to get the bank to fund one yet, but those sort of things you could create atmospheres, that are conducive to that type of enterprise. You don't have to start a university. You just start one at Oxford, one at Cambridge, one in Amsterdam, because then you could do extracurricular stuff with everyone studying extra where they already are.
Jeff, in answer to Henry's question, because I wanted to ask you, what are the areas where you feel that you've mentioned that Robert Schumann's story needs to be told and that there aren't many resources out there, apart from Henry's book, your book, and the book in French we've discussed. Are there any other stories that you think are badly needing retelling? The way that Tom Holland has chosen certain narratives and retold them. Yeah. You've been retrieving narratives. Henry's retrieving an important narrative. What are the particular areas where you see gaps?
Well, we're talking about becoming the frontier persons. What is a frontier person? Somebody who actually is bridging cultures, and it's no accident, as often been pointed out, that Schumann and Adenauer and de Gasperi all came from the frontiers. And they were not from the Sorbonne or Berlin University or whatever, and therefore they were much more conscious of relating to the other and less susceptible to a populist nationalism of a de Gaulle type of variety. So we've got to learn how can we retreat back into our national idea, but build bridges rather than build walls. But to answer your question, it was a key thing for me to realize that God works through faithful minorities, creative minorities. I remember seeing a phrase painted in graffiti on a train station in Switzerland, in Basel. Talked about it. Creative minority complex. We need to get out of our minority complex and have a creative minority complex and realize that God has always been using creative minorities, faithful minorities. Go through the Bible. It's the story of using one person, a family, and a group of people, etc., to actually change things. Then we don't need to think we're just such a small, insignificant minority. God can't use us. No, that's exactly how God has been at work. And so since 2005, my wife and I have been taking people on heritage trips, firstly through the continent, and then we realized, hey, there's a prequel to this. It starts in Dublin, or it starts in Ireland with Patrick, and goes up to Scotland and down through England, and then jumps across with Villebroad and Boniface to Europe. And so we've taken literally hundreds of people on these tours now, 2 weeks long, to introduce people to these stories and to see where did ideas come from? Where did the universities come from? How was our music shaped, et cetera, et cetera? And really, it's only in recent times where this has been so much submerged and we've had an alternative perspective given in our universities and schools and so forth. And we've got to recover that. It's our story. We need to recover that, and we need to be teaching that. To be given those kind of stories, the stories of the Irish Celts. And again, Columbanus is just one of many amazing Irish Celts to whom we're greatly indebted. But many of the other stories as well. And even somebody like Boniface, who sometimes is called the man who's had more influence on the history of Germany than any other person in history. And these perspectives have been lost to a current generation, and history is just being pushed aside so that everybody has to study IT, because that gets you a bread ticket.
Yeah. Just listening to about 1984. And the recrafting of the narratives of history was one of the major things that Orwell saw as quite terrifying. So in this section, just for viewers to entice you to get the book, there's quite a lot of a critique, particularly of Britain, and it's sort of an enticement for Christians to get involved in many different aspects of culture. And there's some hints, business, even politics, but only if you're prepared to undergo a profound transformation, which Christians call holiness, which is to be taken apart as the characters of these books were taken apart by suffering and the sort of training that God does in the wilderness. So there's a whole range of things, and so that's that kind of section. Does anyone else want to just comment on about formation, maybe their own experience or something from this chapter before we move on to talking about Lessing's ditch and this kind of the rather unhelpful Enlightenment settlement that we have now?
I had a thought just while Jeff was talking there, really, about perspective, and that sometimes I think we don't value our own perspective until we realise that we've got it. And perhaps one of the great gifts that a person de frontière, forgive my poor pronunciation, but a person from the frontier has, is that they have a slightly outside perspective. They're still part of whatever unit it is they're part of, be that a culture or a kind of a group of cultures, but they're looking at it slightly differently, and that means that they're then able to see things in a way that others don't, and see ways that they can do something for the benefit of all. And I think I just wanted to underline that point, really, Henry, that what you're trying to suggest in this epilogue isn't, like you said earlier, justice for just us, but actually looking for ways that Christians can have a positive impact on society as a whole.
And that's really why Jeff and I were talking about this the other day. Why De Gasperi, Schumann, Adenauer are actually very, very important, because they did form a bridge between the kind of the world of the ancien regime of cultural Christian hegemony to this new world of where we have to work together. The absolutist era, Maritain called it, is gone. And so those guys, they started new Christian Democrat parties, like, Adenauer let the Zentrum, the Catholic Party, die, and he went on a much broader Christian consensus with the Protestants. So they were quite Well, no, that's a really positive thing. And actually, when you think about it, Columban's time, people like Gregory were also mediating the medieval synthesis, because it was Gregory who was able to, as a flood of barbarians, as we called them, these Teutonic hordes of Volkovondran, as they crossed the Rhine, the Danube, came rushing west, it was Gregory who was actually able to mediate with the barbarians, just leveraging the great Roman name, really. And he was able to, sort of mediate between this great change, which is something similar that's going to happen to Europe in about 60 years' time. So there's things to think about there. But it was people like Gregory, biblically minded, flexible thinkers who are able to do that. So yeah, there's a lot to think about, a lot of nuance, and it does need some thought. And really, this book was intended as that, almost like a manual to start people thinking along those lines back in later. So
coming back to Lessing's ditch, which is the gap between really faith and reason. I think. This is where we come back to Cowper, and we come back to the Reformed philosophical perspective with Herman Dooyeweerd, be familiar to some of us and not to others.
I've just bought Richard Dooyeweerd's was it analytical big fat
his new critique of theoretical thought.
Yeah, so Richard's going to be doing a full study on that.
Yeah, excellent. And his significant contribution, as he critiqued what had become really the dominant narrative in the West, was what we think of as pure reason actually has a faith presuppositional base, and that needs to be exposed, and that perhaps, as James K. Smith says in the introduction to one of the Twilight of Western Thought by Dooyeweerd, he says, perhaps only now, as postmodernism has come to deconstruct this rationalism, now we can start to read Dooyeweerd, and that maybe we are coming to the point that we can engage and help people recognize the dead end road of Enlightenment thinking, of rationalistic thinking, because of its false foundations. And so there's hope here. You talk about the failure of the Enlightenment settlement, Henry. This is where we need to engage, and in a listening dialogue, that we help people come to the final conclusion of where they're at and realize that it fails. And this is where I think that the Reformed philosophical tradition can really be a help for us.
I do.
So that was one of the big surprises I discovered was, when I tried to find people in my own evangelical tradition who could, thought about Europe. There weren't people thinking about Europe. The big discovery was that there was Catholics who were giving us some biblical stuff on this. And Christopher Dawson says, Catholics see woods, Protestants see trees. And he meant by that the Protestants were thinking territorially after the territorial church emerged, the Church of England, the Dutch Reformed Church. Then we had evangelical churches break off, and they didn't think trees, woods or trees, they thought branches. And this is where we got to be expanded in our understanding in order to engage in this highly topical conversation.
Yeah, I'll just read what was in the chapter as almost by way of introduction, just so you did actually articulate it fine. But the German philosopher Gotthold Lessing, 1729 to 1781, articulated the gap, or what he called the ugly wide ditch, der Gastieck breit Graben, I think a German would say, between the claims of historical truth that Lessing claimed could not be demonstrated and the necessary truths of reason which can. In short, reason was in, religion was out. Reason would give us necessary truth. Religion would authenticate itself only by inner truth, or perhaps genuine Christian love. And so, if you're a secular listener, what we're kind of grappling here is the way that Christians are sidelined or told to leave their religious sensibilities, at the door when they enter politics. We speak on the eve, actually, of a Finnish politician, a grandmother of 7 children, who's about to go to court next week, or this week actually, over posting a Bible text within her own network, and it's got her on trial. So, and actually on the 5th of February, I'm having breakfast with ex-leader of the Liberal Democrats, who was shouted down by the media for holding certain views on homosexuality. In fact, I think he turned out not to hold them even, but that was still poor Tim Farron.
Yeah.
So so there's a kind of, so this is what we're talking about. And so if you're a secular listener, bear with us. Do by all means get the chapter. If you don't want to buy the whole book, then just email me and I'll send you the chapter. But this is us trying to feel our way forwards and trying to help people who aren't Christians kind of understand where we're coming from. Okay.
Well, there's an important warning in what Jeff said earlier in critique of the Seven Mountains vision. You were talking about, I think they're called dominionists, aren't they? This idea of taking over areas of culture to get justice for us. Because I was thinking, well, that resembles the old Jesuit policy in the Ancien Regime, which was all about infiltrating countries to get what the Catholic Church wanted out of the polity. And I was thinking we need to be, when we look at Lessing's Ditch and Rousseau and Spinoza and Kant and so on, we shouldn't just dismiss them as the bad guys, because we need to recognize that they came out of the nightmare of Christian disunity and Christian idolatry. So, I mean, the 30 Years' War is one of the main reasons the Enlightenment in the secular sense occurred. So, and I was just thinking that the warning there is that, as Jeff said, that Christians in power, for example, on the right in the States at the moment, well, they're not in power right now in the States, but you know what I mean, they're making the same mistakes that led to the Enlightenment. And in a way, America, we're watching the European history for the last 400 years played out in the States today, in terms of Christians getting it wrong and the secular mind reacting.
Yeah, that's right.
And Henry, you quoted the German Lessing. Let me quote the other German you referred to, and that's Birkenford, in what's sometimes called the Birkenford dilemma, that secularism relies on certain presuppositions and values that it itself cannot sustain. He says it slightly differently here. And this is the point that we need to understand, that secularism is parasitical. It assumes all sorts of things, like, we hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal. We'll forget about the fact that some of them were slave owners. But somebody like Vishal Mangalwadi from India says, well, wait a minute, who says that that's self-evident? In India, nobody believes that. We have this whole caste system. Yeah. So where did you get this idea that it was self-evident? It was from centuries of Christianity. And so much of, is baked into a secular mindset. Well, this is self-evident. Even the idea of time being past, present, and future, that's self-evident. No, we've learnt that. And we've learnt it from the Bible, which started with the words in the beginning and ends about the end. And gives a linear view of history, but that was not the view of history the Greeks and the Romans and so on had. So there's so much of that we take for granted in our Western secular world that actually has faith presuppositions.
Yeah, that's right. And really, one of the claims here is that we're entering, what Jürgen Habermas says is probably the post-secular age. So we're already, just on the basis of brute demographics, we're going to be entering into that world as migration increases. And of course, just because we've sort of had a social welfare systems in Europe, very successful, but they're based on a kind of religious birth rate, which we've not had since the 80s. So in other words, it's a kind of a time-limited experiment, the kind of secular experiment, to about 100 years before everyone's, gone or basically replaced. So, I mean, demography apparently is not destiny, but it usually is, without any kind of very careful planning or some amazing technology to take the place. But so that's a really important thought as we, and one of my points here really was that with Islamic immigration increasing, Christians may be very well placed to form a bridge there politically. Did we talk about it with someone else and they'd had the same thought? I can't remember.
It's Josh Horden, Professor Horden.
Professor Horden, and he'd actually done some dialogue, hadn't he? That Oxford
he had, he's involved in a group, I think, or some research. I can't remember exactly.
Yeah, so that kind of struck me as a sort of an obvious point.
Yeah, what does it mean to be the frontier person in relationship to Muslim culture?
Yeah. So that's quite, and I mentioned that here. Any other points? I know Richard's saying less because Richard very kindly annotated for the second edition. He's got his book and he's scribbled the whole way through it, all the terrible errors I've made. So when the second edition comes out, it's going to be so good. But it means that Richard actually he's not even looking at a book.
No.
So.
But I think this is Jeff, this is very well matched to discuss the epilogue, because we're looking beyond the book into applications, and the Schumann Center is the absolute ideal expression. I'm sorry, Jeff, I hadn't picked up from Henry what the Schumann Center was exactly. Henry, that book you gave me on Schumann in French and English, was that from the Schumann Center?
French and English? Oh, is it a magazine?
Well, it's a sort of booklet, about 50, 70 pages.
No, he said written in English.
Yeah. I think I think that may have been from Schumann's house, Lawrence.
I'll go and have a look. I'll bring it over.
Yeah, okay.
You started off talking about the looming crisis.
Yeah.
And this is where we've got to recognize, yes, we are coming to a point where we're hitting dead ends. We don't have the answers from that used to work. We're running out of the memory of the memory of the memory of Christian values, as it were. And it's essential that that we would position ourselves as frontier people, equipped, ready to provide answers, and to engage. I mean, we don't have all the answers either. To engage in dialogue, and we also need to recognize something called common grace, where God is at work in society, even outside of the church, and we need to recognize where that is happening. And very often the church has gotten it wrong. We've gotten it wrong. Evangelicals gotten it wrong when those they've criticized or we've criticized have actually been closer to the truth.
Yeah, and there's loads of that in this chapter. Sort of, we've got to watch ourselves. And I mean, it came as a bit of a shock.
Yeah, that's a very good, helpful book. That comes from the Schumann Foundation, I believe. Yeah, Robert Schumann Foundation.
So is that not the same thing as your center?
No. There's actually several. I have in the back of my book. There's about 4 or 5 different institutions with the name Schumann in it, and it can be a little confusing. But the Robert Schumann Foundation is really a Christian Democratic related foundation that has excellent resources, monthly letters, and so forth. In fact, one just came in today.
I got
that's worth. And they produce the one book that Robert Schumann wrote for Europe. You can buy it from them for €5. Yeah.
Right. They send out a good kind of newsletter. I think it's
thank you,
which I get by email. So there's always lots of interesting news. So this. I mean, when we talk about the Enlightenment, really, this is Richard's bag, and there's loads here. We quote Butterfield, loads of secular historians as well, prominent atheists as well. We talk about it, really to show that there's an awful lot of kind of religious suppositions built into modern secular thinking. Anything, Richard, you wanted to say? I mean,
well,
Richard,
I've just got a general question, Jeff, is that I'm looking to do some sort of master's. I've been talking to my Kuiperian friends at various conferences, and I'm just about to, I've had COVID, and I've just got, well, we've had the whole household's had COVID eventually, and I'm the last, so there's been delays, but I'm still testing positive, so I'm a bit sleepy tonight. But I was talking to the Kuiperians at the latest conference, Jeff, about where I could do a master's and whether they're offering online master's courses. So I've been talking to all the Doivid scholars around the world, because I do feel drawn. I mean, Henry bought me a year ago as a 50th birthday present. Thank you, Henry. The Doivid's magnum opus, which I'd been hearing about for 35 years, but I'd never been able to buy a copy because it was so expensive. So it was a brilliant present, but it's hard work and I'm working through it slowly. You know, I spent most of last year just on volume 1. But I felt drawn to Kant's legal theory, and I've been trying to get papers published on Kant, just on history of philosophy. But I'm very interested in Doivid and how he takes the phenomenological and Kantian tradition into legal theory, ethics, politics. And Jonathan Chaplin and I have been talking for years. He's sort of an academic mentor to me. But he's a difficult mentor to have because he's so damn busy. But he's generous, he's just busy. So I've been looking around thinking, where could I study? And I was interested in your masters. I've been having a look, but it looks a bit churchy for me, because I'm not called to the church mountain. You know, I'm not. I do preach, but I'm not.
When we linked up with Four Mission College to do this program, I was looking for a place to park what we did within a Bologna system, you know, the university system in Europe. And Four Mission very kindly opened this way to merge with an existing program they had on missional leadership.
Right.
Now, for me, it was a little bit like marrying Leah to get to Rachel, because I was really wanting to have a public theology and European studies course.
Yeah.
But things move slowly in the academic world, and I'm still pushing for that. But that won't be happening next year.
Yeah.
And indeed, it is. It's assuming the students are coming, church workers, and wanting to get trained. But what I'm really looking for is to train people for the public sphere. Now, I would suggest I can send you the details of Michael Wageman, who's written the best little introduction to Cowper that I know of. It's called Engaging the World with Abraham Cowper. It's a $10 book. And it's a very good starting point to understand Cowper. But he is currently, I'm in a reading group with him on Doiveerd, on his Twilight of Western Thought. And so he would be a very good person to ask your question, where can I do something online on Doiveerd? But you're asking the very kind of question that, why don't we have courses available for people to train people with the necessary tools to engage with our world today? And I know, you know, LICC, the London Institute of Contemporary Christianity,
I've trained with them.
Promoting something called Whole Life Mission for the Whole Church. And that is, how do we encourage people to overcome the sacred secular divide through theological education? But it's kind of, how do we equip people to take their faith into the work situation, which is very, very good as far as it goes. But it's not critiquing the sphere of politics, or the sphere of economics, or the sphere of entertainment, or sphere of education, or journalism, and so on, and giving us the tools to see how do we put things on different foundations. We don't actually. We have such a limited time in the three modules that we do on European studies. There's so much more that we need to be able to do.
Yeah, it's specifically the European studies I'm interested in. I want to study European studies, really, something to do with that. And I'm just feeling my way, because I'm having a sort of midlife break, in the sense that I've got time to think and write and read at the moment. But I've got so many. I'm just feeling drawn towards Doiveerd and law and politics.
Well, I would expect that the Free University would have such courses. But I was talking recently to one of the professors there, Govert Bowers, and I said, "Well, who can I talk to, you know, on the areas of my interest?" And he couldn't think of anybody at the time. Now, he himself actually ran some very good master's classes on Christianity and culture and Christianity and society. Doesn't do that anymore. But that's lacking. It's lacking, you know, and it's the response I got from one of the networks in Europe was, well, yeah, but what kind of jobs would people get from, you know, study this? Why would they want to study that? You know, because all he could think of really, I think, was engagement in the church rather than in the life sphere.
Exactly. Andy, did you have something you wanted to add before? I saw a message, sorry.
I dropped a message about Tom Holland. There's some really interesting YouTube videos of him having discussions about, after particular books he's published, and his discussions that you mentioned, Jeff, about his realization of where his identity and culture and his way of framing and focusing on culture, his own value system, comes from. Yeah. So I just sort of thought I'd mention that, Henry, in case you wanted to add add a link.
Good. Yeah, he's done a couple of podcasts with Unbelievable, you know, the Christian Premier Christian radio TV show. So look, just wrapping up then, this thing about Lessing's ditch, we need to be kind of proactive in making the ditch less ugly. That means learning to reach our arms across the chasm, to be people on the frontier, which will mean being misunderstood by both camps, presenting a rather good target for both camps. And but then when you think about how few people, and Jeff's already said this, and this chapter, mentioned how few people it takes sometimes to make a difference, then that is kind of one of the great challenges when we look at these people, these unexpected possibilities of renewal that can happen just because a couple of hobbits decide to leave the Shire. So, I'm actually very pessimistic. I think wickedness will wax worse and prevail. And yet, having written this book, how can you say that when you see what God can do with one or two faithful people? So let's go and make the ditch less ugly. If anyone wants to know more, please drop me a line. We're moving on to the conclusion of this, which is basically the conclusion of the conclusion. And it's basically a personal challenge to be actors, but not just audience members in the drama of Western civilization. And it's one of those kind of get out of the boat and learn to walk on water kind of pleas, using some Winston Churchill quotes and some Alistair McIntyre, I can see. Some Herbert Butterfield as well, who I only discovered very latterly in this. And I mean, one of my great finds. And he was a Cambridge history professor who was a devout
He's
Methodist.
great, yeah.
Yeah, loved it.
His book, The Whig Interpretation of History, really had a huge impact on historiography, and you've quoted that in your book.
Yeah, love it. I'll just read a little bit if you like. I think it's Butterfield, Christianity and European History, 1951. Professor Butterfield says, above all, he's a Yorkshireman, that should just give him some kudos for some of the listeners. Above all, throughout our history, it has been of the first importance that the church stands as a perpetual center from which the whole process can be forever starting over again. Think about Columbanus and Gregory and all those guys, Martin of Tours, Hilary of Poitiers. Those who preach the gospel, nurse piety, spread the New Testament love, and affirm the spiritual nature of man are guarding the very source and keeping open the very spring from which new things will still arise. The continually renascent power of our religion seems to consist in this unlimited opportunity to return to the original spring, the original simplicities of the faith. So that's from one of the premier historians of the 20th century in Britain, anyway. Nothing is written. As Omar Sharif says in Lawrence of Arabia, and unless someone write it. So, there's a real point for Britain. I'm hoping that this, that Brexit and our different status in the coming decades will really bring something good from our nation. That's my kind of hope. But of course, that does depend on probably the people reading their Bibles back home and listening to this. So anyway, and comments from people on this.
Returning to the original spring, that is really going to the source of the soul. And this was Erasmus's message again and again, as he talked about ad fontes, back to the source. And he said this, and usually that's seen as, we've got to go back to the classics, the Romans and the Greeks. And no, that's not what he's talking about. He says, I mean by that, the Gospels, the letters, and the church fathers, the early church fathers. Those are the original springs, ad fonte. So that's really our message. How do we find the soul of Europe? And what does that mean? This is not turning the clock back. We're not talking about going back to Christendom. God forbid. It's unexplored territory, and this is a big challenge that we face. As what does it mean to be agents of renewal for our Western civilization? And what does it mean to rediscover the soul, rediscover the springs?
I mean, it falls heavy on us because we have history as well to think about, and we have such great examples. But in every sphere, I was thinking, I've mentioned in this chapter, this epilogue, social services. One of the great difficulties in 20, 30 years' time is there'll be no money for social care. So we need to start planning. We need to help and inspire Christian entrepreneurs, other entrepreneurs now to think about how do we deal with grandparents, or basically me in 30 years' time, because there will be no money really. And there's a lovely book I mentioned called Frank Prochaska's book, Christianity and Social Services in Modern Britain, that looks at the Victorian legacy and what an extraordinary amount of Christian activity there was in education and social services, hospitals, Reinhard Bible nurses. Not tweedy women do-goodery, it was people dying of the diseases in the slums in London, going out. So we've got to think, and this is Tom Holland picks this up, you know, the expansion of Christianity. Rodney Stark picks this up as well. It was the Christians, you know, they went into the pandemics to rescue people. They took the exposed infants that were left to die at the side of the Temple of Apollo. And I think it's going to be people like the Frank Bookmans of this world, misunderstood, slightly odd people, forming new networks, and the church needs to be placed. And maybe churches can't be placed because they only think ecclesiastically. So maybe we need other institutions, like Jeff's talking about, to inspire spiritual entrepreneurs and affirm them in their, you know, who would have listened to Francis of Assisi? The Pope only did probably because he had a dream the night before. And so, you know, saw a ragged man holding up the church. You know, help comes in very odd, you know, these kind of strange people. I'd like to do all I could to inspire and to, you know, provide some kind of launch pad for people who have got crazy ideas.
Thank you, Jeff, for what you said. God works through faithful, creative minorities. I wrote, do not despair, regroup. Because we've been looking at the monks and the way that God brought together Gasperi, Adenauer and Schumann as a group of saints in suits to set up the project. And we've been looking at Columbanus and his various teams. And Henry's done a lovely sensitive portrayal of all the different teams and brotherhoods. There's a great witness there to Christian fellowship. So the sort of thing we're doing right now here, networking and encouraging one another, is precisely what you're saying. But I agree with you about, you know, there's so, like, the whole of the scriptures is about individuals and small groups punching massively above their weight because the Almighty is with them.
Romans chapter 9. And it was only God. It was his way, the only way he worked. He doesn't, you know, to Gideon's army, he hasn't got any need for. So.
There's lots of reasons to be pessimistic. You use the term pessimism, Henry. Especially right now, you know, we're wondering what Vladimir Putin's next move is going to be. And there's lots of people can find all sorts of evidence to say, oh, you know, this is the end of things, the end times, and so forth. And we can look at history like Oswald Spengler did. As kind of a biological model of birth, maturing, and eventually death. And, you know, there was the expectation that Christianity was supposed to disappear over the horizon round about now, which, of course, it hasn't done. I prefer to see history in terms of how Arnold Toynbee saw it. And that was more like the Book of Judges. You go up and down, up and down, up and down, all these renewals of civilization and society. And you take the Book of Judges, and for those of you, you know, there's a book in the Old Testament about Israel's history before they had kings. And there were judges that God raised up at different times. And there's a whole pattern of renewal and then falling into all sorts of apostasy. And then a new person comes along and God uses that person, might be a woman sometimes as well. It's not just, sometimes people think the Bible is all just misogynist, but it's not. And then unlikely people, Jephthah, the son of a prostitute, for example, and God gave him a new identity. And so you have this renewal going on. Now, you stretch that out over 2,000 years, and that's the story, actually, of Christianity. There's terrible phases, but there's great phases as well. And we may be getting it to the lowest point, but then we are approaching that point where the Holy Spirit will do something new, probably from the fringes. And that's why I think, you know, we need to recognize that Christianity is all about death and resurrection. And we have hope in spite of the current evidence. We're not optimists. We are realistic. We have hopeful realism because our realism includes a God who is committed to working out his purposes in human history. And that's given me a lot of hope.
And we need to look beyond Europe, I always say, because, you know, if you look at Africa, South America, Asia over the last 100 years, it's in terms of the kingdom and the church, it's all good news. It's just been massive breakthrough after massive breakthrough, and in many ways, in the West, that wave hasn't hit us yet. We're in the secularizing post-Enlightenment part of the world.
We have Eurotunnel vision. We don't see what's going on in the rest of the world. The number of Christians in Africa has doubled in the last 30 years from 300 million to 600 million. 600 million, you know, that's more than the population of the EU itself.
But also the breakthroughs in China. After all these centuries, in East Asia, the enemy just stamped out every breakthrough in East Asia. Now we have a thriving Chinese church. My only worry is what's happening to them inside the nightmare Chinese state, but we just don't know.
Yeah, and that's in spite of the lack of democracy, etc.
Yeah.
The good news is we are living in the most exciting phase of church history ever.
Yeah, amen.
Yeah. So, you know, I don't want anyone to think that I'm pessimistic in that way. In some senses, it's not for us to know the times. You know, you just work while it is day. You know, there's this call. I love the words. I think it's the guy Henry Varley. I think they find themselves these words into D.L. Moody's mouth, but it's Henry Varley who said them. The world is yet to see what God could do with a man fully consecrated to him. By his grace, I aim to be that man. And we have one shot to, you know, give our lives to something. And there is nothing bigger that we're being called to.
I would say the world has not yet seen it. The world's seen it many times. What we need to do is that the stories get forgotten, so we need to retrieve them. We need to retrieve the stories of those who have
telling these stories. Remember, that's a recurrent word all the way through the Old Testament. Remember, remember, don't forget. And we live in a society with amnesia.
Yeah. The first thing the world does to us is tell us is you know, demolish the stories of the kingdom so that we don't know what's just happened.
Well, that's the first thing, you know, that somebody wants to take over. It creates a new narrative. You know, it's newspeak.
Double speak. It's
don't give in to pessimism, Henry, because we wouldn't be where we are today if Robert Schumann had got pessimistic and shrugged his shoulders.
He was just, he was extraordinary.
Well, he did get pessimistic, and then along came Frank Buchmann to give him new hope. You know, that's where the idea of talking to each other and fellowship comes in. We need each other.
I mean, I've literally been editing that exact conversation today. I'm actually sitting up at Co in the dining room reading it, but it's a conversation he has with Buchmann in Paris at Louis Bouquet's house, I think.
I keep thinking that, I mean, Henry's book is wonderful. I found it very moving and full of wonderful insights, and it's just right up my street because I'm all about retrieving lost histories. But I was also thinking we need screenplays, we need plays, we need things that can get on the stage and in the film that to catch people's imaginations. I always think of William Nicholson's play Shadowlands 30 years ago that got discovered for the stage. It was on television with Joss Nicholson, I can't remember his name, the actor. And then it was in Hollywood with Anthony Hopkins, Deborah Winger. And that's full of Christian, you know, stuff. And I've always thought, since I saw that, you know, we just need to write plays. We need to write screenplays. We need to create things that will be seen by large numbers of people that communicate these stories. You see what I mean? Because I just think so much of the story that Henry's retrieved for me. I mean, I'd never heard of any of this story of Schumann. I'd heard of Schumann, I'd heard of Adenauer, and I admired him. I'd never heard of Gasperi. But the way that Henry's retrieved these stories and tied them together, I think I can get that through a prose book, but a lot of people can't. They would just look at Henry's book and think, no, my brain cannot deal with that. So I think we need other forms, you know, visual forms.
If I can tell a story, if there's time for a story, Henry was just talking about Co. That Co was the center for reconciliation up in the mountains above Lake Geneva, above Montreux. That the movement that Frank Buchmann began had created, the moral rearmament. Now, this is one of the things they did. In fact, Henry, you would have seen the big theater that they have there. They wrote these theaters, and that they had the Old Vic Theatre, I think, in London, where they put on plays and so on. And one time when I was in Co, I've been there many times, I met an old Norwegian. I believe he's passed away now. He wrote a book called Out of the Dark Night he was a teenager when he joined up during the war. And then he got involved in these plays and going through the Ruhr Valley after the war. And they put on these plays that challenge people as to their worldview and how could we create a better world. And actually, through the trade union movement, trade union leaders actually became believers through these events. And at a time when the whole trade union movement was under the control of the Kremlin, and there are notes in the Kremlin about this movement that was spoiling their plans. And it was actually created a whole new atmosphere in the Ruhr Valley with the industrial relationships through plays. So I'm just trying to say, here's an example of what you're talking about, Richard.
Yes, and I suppose that those plays have been lost. I love, like, when an old friend shows me their library or someone dies and lets me look through their books, you find these amazing Christian products from the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s. Rosie's father died 2 years ago, and all these lovely old books, all these wonderful Christian books, plays, poems, works, completely forgotten, no longer published. And I just thought, oh yeah. And in many ways, we keep reinventing the wheel. We think, oh, I've got to do this. It's been done. We've just got to find it.
Oh, very good. Very good. I'm seriously thinking, when we're in Italy next, I don't know if we'll have time in Italy in the spring, but writing a musical about
please do. You'd be perfectly placed to do that.
For De Gasperi, because having seen the Hamilton. Oh my goodness! I mean, it's just incredible. Hip hop. I've never written hip hop, but how hard can it be? We'll see.
I don't think it's your bag. Do country and western.
Yeah, that's right. Well, because with Mussolini, you could make a very good Nemesis-y type.
Yeah, I think you could do brilliant comic plays. You're so good at characterization.
Yeah, the thing is to act beyond your kind of comfort zone, and that would be definitely beyond.
2 years ago, I was obsessed with the idea of writing a musical about the life of Adam Smith.
I know. Again, absolutely would be superb. So if anyone's out there listening who's got any talent for these things, for goodness sake, get in touch and save the genre.
Yeah, I can't write melodies, basically, but I'd love the idea of it.
Yeah. I think Adam Smith's so well known, it would be very good. Right, so any final comments there? If we just want to wrap up, don't we, really, and just say thank you.
I want to say thank you, Jeff. You've been a real encouragement.
Yeah.
Oh, it was great to be with you all. I think this is to be continued.
Yeah, I'd love to visit you and visit your centre. And I quite like the idea of these tours that you do, the heritage tours. That's just, Rosie and I do that sort of thing all the time within the British Isles, but the idea of doing it European is exciting. And I'd love to come to one of these conferences. So Henry, you were at one of these conferences, one of these annual things. Yeah,
well, hopefully if Jeff's on his way to Paris to try and get it all planned for May, but it's sort of 6th and 7th, hopefully, of May this year.
Yeah, I mean, Paris in May sounds lovely.
Anywhere in May.
You just get on the Eurostar or whatever.
Yeah. You'd have to smuggle yourself.
Yeah, the theme is going to be what is the evangelical contribution to the future of Europe? And
that'll be too depressing. I don't want to talk about it. All right, I need to go.
Right. So
thank you.
Yeah. So thanks everyone. Please look down, subscribe, make your comments. Let's get a conversation going because there's so much we just haven't had time to do tonight. We do thank Jeff very much and Romke for lending out the front room in Amsterdam. Once again, many congratulations to Andrew and Susanna on their engagement. Yay! While there is romance, Europe will survive. So thank you everyone and good night. Well done, guys. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Henry.
Remember also that this journey was part of the research for a book which uses the lives of Colin Barnes and Schumann to explore the unlikely arrival, survival, victory and atrophy of European civilization. Do follow the links below to find out more. Please let us know what you thought of this episode, what you liked, what you didn't, what was new to you. Just start a conversation below in the comments section. And of course, if you found the content helpful, then we're pretty sure you're going to like this next one suggested here. But also while you're there, don't forget to help us by subscribing to the channel. Thanks for watching.